Music theory with OneNote, modal chord inversions, comparing and contrasting the naming of inverted chords using a traditional system which focuses in on the note names to a more streamlined modal system focusing in on the modal points and modal distance, this time looking at the major chords, those built off of the Ionian node, the Lydian node, the Mixolydian node. So get ready and some coffee, because although we're just playing with one note, it's a beautiful note. You're not required to, but if you have access to it and would like to follow along, we're currently in the OneNote file of Modal Node System, MNS, Presentation 1384, OneNote, Modal Chord Inversions, Major Chords. List of presentations on the right-hand side. Also noting, in this OneNote presentation, we'll spend all our time on music theory, but we have another similarly numbered and named, or multiple similarly numbered and named presentations where we actually build these tables in Excel, practicing not only music theory, but Excel table visualization as well. So we want to be thinking about the chords now, and then focusing in on or adding the concept of inversions. In a prior section or course, we looked at the standard chord naming convention, particularly for those nodes or those nodal points, chords built off of a 7-note collection. So this is the normal naming convention we would have for normal chords built off of the 7-note collection: 3-note chords, 4-note chords, 5-note chords, 6-note chords, 7-note chords. The problem with this convention, however, is it doesn't give us any context about how we're playing or how we're using that chord within the collection. In other words, we have the major bucket could be including chords built off of the Ionian, or chords built off of the Mixolydian or the Lydian. The minor bucket could be chords that are going to be built off of the Aeolian node, or the Phrygian node, or the Dorian node. The dominant bucket doesn't have anything up top, because that would be in the major bucket, and then everything else is going to be built off of the Mixolydian node. The diminished and half diminished buckets are two buckets that you need just to cover those chords built off of the Locrian node, and then the extension buckets are going to be the major extensions that could be for those major chords that need an extension, and then the minor extension for the chords that need a minor extension when we add more notes. So this doesn't really tell you, again, context. It would be nice to have a naming convention that does tell you context, which we took a look at in a prior presentation, naming the chords by nodal point. Here's going to be a fretboard where we have the low or heavy E string, the one closest to the ceiling, on top. What we'd like to be able to say is, this is the collection of notes around the key of C. When I build a chord off of this node, say the Ionian node, I'd like to give it a naming convention that tells me where I am in the shape, as opposed to having to recreate or rename all of the notes in order to build a chord. If I go to the Aeolian chord, for example, I'd like to have a naming convention that's going to be built off of the Aeolian node as opposed to the note name, because the Aeolian chord tells me something about not only the chord shape, but whether or not it fits in the collection of notes that I am in. Whereas if I just call it an A note name chord, it does not give me any of that added information. So now we're going to add the next bit of detail, which is going to be the inversion of the chords, meaning we have the same kind of chord, but possibly we have the lowest note in the chord something other than the tonic. So we want to be able to name that inversion. Normally, under normal naming conventions, what it does is it names a slash and then the note that's going to be in the bass, or the lowest note. That's, again, very inefficient because it results in these very long chords, and it's not going to be transposable because we're once again looking at notes instead of at distance or modal position. So that's going to be the idea. So if we go up top and look at our system, we're going to be looking at all 7-note chords. So we're going to build the longest, most complex chord off of each of the nodal points, starting with just the major nodal points, meaning chords built off of the Ionian node, the Lydian node, and the Mixolydian node. We want to look at the most complex chords, because inversions then are most complex under those chords, and then you can make it more easy for chords of a lesser amount of notes, meaning a 3-note triad, a 4-note chord, a 5-note chord, a 6-note chord, and then a 7-note chord. If you have 7 notes, any one of those 7 notes could be the inversion. Therefore, if you count all the inversions, you have the standard format of the chord and then 6 inversions on that standard format of the chord. So for example, let's start with a C major 13 chord. So if we're in the collection of notes around the key of C and we're building off of the Ionian node, which in that case would be a C, then we can name it C major 13. The 13 is a distance term, in essence, a scale degree term that's naming the last note that we're adding, or the distance, in essence, to the last note that we're adding. So then we can say /E. The E represents the note that's going to be the lowest note in the bass tone, highest on the guitar, but lowest in terms of pitch. The problem here is, how do I know what that E is? I have to kind of figure out, I mean, if you're playing on like a guitar, you might reach that E and say, oh, I'm going to grab that one, make it the lowest, and just name it the E because I know that note on the guitar. But it's not really transposable because we're not even naming the scale degree. You would think that it would name the scale degree, such as it would be the third is going to be the lowest. But no, why is that a problem? Because then when you go to all the other nodal points and when you go to all other 12 collections of 7 notes, it's not uniform, right? You're just memorizing the note. So it's going to be a lot more difficult for you to map this out in your mind and think about it conceptually and be able to basically do the same thing through all 12 collections of notes, because that letter is going to be different every time, whereas if it at least was the scale degree, it would be kind of the same every time. So in other words, we're going to take the second note in the collection, make that the lowest note. So if I was looking at it from scale degrees, it would be 1, 3, 5, and so on and so forth. The third then is going to be the lowest note, which happens to be in the collection of notes around the key of C, an A note. All right, and so over here you could see the modal points. If we're looking at it by modal points, it's going to be the Phrygian, and all the way over here we could see the notes mapped out, and that's going to be the E. That's where that E is pulling from. So that's going to be that. Now, it would be a lot better to say, I'd like to name it by relative position. Instead of saying it's a C note, I'm going to build off of the Ionian. If I build off of the Ionian node, or nodal point number 1, then how would I know what letter it is? I know what letter it is because I'm going to tell the system, like is done with sheet music, I'm going to tell you what collection of notes we are playing in. If you know the collection of notes, then I'm going to build off of the Ionian, and that way everything could be more uniform and it'll give you context about the song, whereas a C chord doesn't give you the context. And so I can call it a 7-note Ionian, or the bass part could be a 6 Ionian, meaning 6 modal whole steps. Those, I think, are the most succinct way to actually name the chords, so that you're not basically naming all the chords as though you have to compare them to the major chord, right? A 7-note Ionian could also be an I6, because I6 is going to be the 7 notes minus 1, meaning it's 6 modal whole steps up to get to the last note in the chord, because as we measure the chords, we take modal whole steps. Let's take a quick look at that for a second here. Notice I have modal whole steps, modal half steps, and scale degrees. If we look at the normal naming convention, we often use the scale degree because that's going to make the first one that we're on, the tonic, the 1. The problem with that is it forces us to rename the system every time we go to another point, even if we're not changing the collection of notes. So it would be more useful to use the modal whole step system, or the modal half step system. The modal half step system will be always less by 1 than the scale degree, but because it's actual distance term, we don't have to have this compound scale degree like a 9, 11, and 13. And a scale degree doesn't make sense because there's only 7 scale degrees, but it makes sense from a distance standpoint to have that 8, 10, and 12. When you measure the chord, it's actually more efficient to name it by modal whole steps, because we're going to take every other note. That's how you build out a chord. So if we list the chords out by point, it would be Ionian to Phrygian to Mixolydian to Locrian, Dorian, Lydian, and Aeolian, or that would be the nodal points that we're going to be basically looking at. So if I say it's a 7 Ionian /1, the /1 is going to be the inversion point. Instead of naming the E as the note, I could name the equivalent, which would be the modal point, meaning it would be a 3, or it would be the P for Phrygian. But you could do that colloquially while you're playing, because you might be able to, if you're fingering the guitar, that might be the easy thing to do. But to make it universal, it would be better to say I'm going to be /1, the 1 standing for the first inversion, meaning take the one that's 1 modal whole step up from the tonic, and that's where the inversion will be applied. So that means you're gonna take this Phrygian will be the lowest note. Now also note that colloquially, when you're just playing on the guitar, the first inversion is just gonna mean put that Phrygian on top, even though I'm seeing it as an Ionian chord, a major chord, and all the other notes are going to be in whatever order you can grab them, right? And you're not going to get all 7 notes on a guitar, right? So you're going to drop some notes as well. But if you put this into like a MIDI system, or try to put it into a computer, then I would like to be more specific about the inversion and say the Phrygian is going to be the lowest, and then it's going to go in the same order. Phrygian, Mixolydian, Locrian, Dorian, Lydian, Aeolian, and then Ionian will be the highest pitched note if it was in a more stringent MIDI system, so you could define all the terms, and then you can get more specific within it. Meaning in a DAW system, I believe that you should be able to write down the stack of notes, as well as write down standard chord conversion as chords, and be able to expand or extract the map that you're looking at when doing the data input. And you can put normal chords that will be normally stacked, but then it would be nice if you can also put the standard inversions, and possibly even get more complex, adding notes and dropping notes, or adjusting up or down 1 note octave within the chord construction without having to stack all the chords, right? That would be a useful thing. But anyways, so those are going to be, what if I had then a second inversion? Well, then it would just be normal naming convention, C major 13, but it's going to be inverted on the G, meaning that the node number 5 happens to be a G in the collection of notes around the key of C. Again, that's not very efficient because it's not transposable, because you have 2 notes in it. So if you have a different collection of notes, you're going to have to transpose the C and the G to something different. And it would be nicer to just call it a 7I/2 for a 7-note Ionian chord second inversion, meaning invert the note on the second modal whole step, meaning 2 modal whole steps up would be the Mixolydian. You could see it this way or this way. The Mixolydian is going to be the lowest note. And so that would be a lot cleaner. Or you can say it's an I6/2, meaning an Ionian 6 modal whole step /2, make the inversion on the second modal whole step up, or the second note after the tonic. So it's nice and just perfect in terms of distance terminology, right? The second inversion means look at the tonic, go 2 modal whole steps up, that's the lowest note. Make that the lowest note. All right, and then so if it's the next one, obviously then it would be a C major 13/B, because we're going to invert on the 3rd modal whole step up, which happens to be a B in the collection of notes around the key of C. Again, this isn't transposable. It'd be a lot nicer to call it a 7I/3 for a 7-note Ionian 3rd inversion, meaning going 3 modal whole steps up from the root, and that'll get you there. That happens to be a Locrian in this case. And so then we can say, okay, or we can call it a 6I/3, so an I6/3, or we could say it's a 7I. The next one would be a C major 13/D, meaning the 4th inversion. So that node number 2 happens to be a D in a collection of notes around the key of C, but not transferable. So it would be better to call it a 7I/4 for a 7-note Ionian 4th inversion. or an I6/4 for a Ionian 6 modal half whole step /4, because we're going to invert on the note that is 4 modal whole steps up from the root, which happens to be, in this case, nodal point number 2, which is a Dorian. So then we can say the next one would be a C major 13/F, because we're inverting here, which happens to be an F. Would be better to call it an I6/5, meaning it should be better to call it a 7I/5 or I6/5. 7I/5, 7-note Ionian, fifth modal whole step is where you do the inversion, or an I6/5, meaning an Ionian 6 modal whole step inversion on the 5th modal whole step up from the root. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're going to invert that nodal point number 4, which is going to be the Lydian nodal point. So then we have finally a C major 13/A for inverting on the last one, which would be better called a 7-note Ionian /6, or an I6/6, 7-note Ionian 6th inversion, or an Ionian 6 modal whole step 6th inversion. You go 6 modal whole steps up, and that's the point of inversion, which in this case is on the Aeolian node, node number 6. So similarly, on the Lydian, we have the similar kind of idea, of course. We're going to say we have these 7-note chords, and the Lydian, if it was a normal 7-note Lydian chord, it would be a major chord type, but I'd have to add that sharp 11. So if the Lydian was in the collection of notes around the key of C, then the Lydian node would be an F. So we would be building off of the F node, because that's how you build a Lydian chord in the collection of notes around the key of C. So that would be an F major 13 or sharp 11 if you had the full 7-note chord, the most complex chord. Then we can say /A, meaning it's going to be the first inversion, which means you're going to do the inversion on what happens to be the A note. So it would be better to call it as 7Y/1, the Y standing for Lydian, instead of using an L, so that we don't have 2 L's and the L looks like a 1. So a 7Y/1 or a Y6/1, meaning it's a 7-note Lydian first inversion, invert on the first modal whole step up, which happens to be node point 6, which would be the Aeolian, or it's going to be a Lydian 6 modal whole step /1, Lydian 6 modal whole step first inversion, make the inversion point 1 modal whole step up from the tonic. If we say the next one, it would be an F major 13 sharp 11/C, second inversion. The C happens to be 2 modal whole steps up, or the third note, right? But it would be better, notice this system, when I say it's a second inversion, you have to you're still kind of thinking it's the second note up in the normal stack. But it doesn't really give you the distance term if you don't use the idea of modal whole steps, right? If you use the idea of modal whole steps, it all snaps into place, because you just say, well, it's a 7Y/2 or a Y6/2, meaning it's a 7-note built off of the Lydian node, second inversion, meaning you go 2 modal whole steps up from the root, which would get you to modal point 1, or the Ionian mode. That's the lowest note point of inversion. Or Lydian 6 modal whole step, second inversion, once again going 2 notes up and making the inversion. Next one, if we do the third inversion, that would be an F major 13 sharp 11/E, because the third inversion happens to be an E. It would be cleaner to say it's a 7Y/3 or a Y6/3 for a 7-note Lydian chord third inversion, or Lydian 6 modal whole step chord third inversion, go 3 notes up, 3 modal whole steps up to make that the lowest node, which happens to be point number 3, which would be a Phrygian. So then the next one on the fourth inversion would be an F major 13 sharp 11/G, which would be better to say it's going to be a 7Y/4 or a Y6/4 for 7-note Lydian fourth inversion, or Lydian 6 modal whole step fourth inversion, meaning you're going to take the nodal point that's going to be 4 modal whole steps up from the root and make the inversion, which happens to be on nodal point 5, which is Mixolydian. And the next one is going to be The sixth inversion, so F major 13 sharp 11 slash B, would rather be a 7Y/5 or a Y6/5 for 7-note Lydian fifth inversion, or a Lydian 6 modal whole steps fifth inversion, meaning go 5 modal whole steps up from the root. That'll be the lowest note or point of inversion. And finally, for the Lydian, we have an F major 13 sharp 11/D, which would better be the 7Y/6 or Y6/6, which would be a 7-note Lydian 6th inversion, or a Lydian 6th modal whole step 6th inversion, meaning go 6 modal whole steps up and pick that one for the lowest note, which happens to be nodal point number 2, which is a Dorian. And then lastly, on the major nodes, we'd have the Mixolydian. We're going to build on the Mixolydian, which in the collection of notes around the key of C happens to be note 11, which is a G. So then we could say, okay, that then is going to be 7-note chords across here. And so now, normally, if it was a 7-note Mixolydian chord, it has its own naming convention. So we call that then the note name and then the number 13 for the scale degree. So it would be a 7-note Mixolydian chord off of the G would be a G13, and then /B for the first inversion, because the second note in the normal stack would be the lowest note, which would be the Locrian, happening to be a B in the collection of notes around the key of C. It would be better still, even though this one isn't as long and ugly, it still has the same problem of having the notes that aren't transposable. So if I transpose this thing, I have to change both the G and the B to the new collection of notes, because they didn't use scale degrees in either one of those or modal points. Whereas if I used a 7x/1, X standing for Mixolydian, or an X6/1, then the whole thing would be transposable. I wouldn't even have to rewrite it. I'd just have to say, look, this is in the collection of notes around the key of C, and then this is in the collection of notes around, the key of D or whatever, and the whole thing would transpose, no problem. So that would mean a 7-note Mixolydian first inversion, or a Mixolydian 6 modal whole step first inversion, meaning go first 1 modal whole step up from the root. That's the lowest note point of inversion, which would be nodal point number 7. That's going to be the Locrian node. Next, we have a second inversion, G13/D, would better be 7x/2 or x6/2, which would be a 7-note Mixolydian second inversion, or Mixolydian 6 modal whole step second inversion, meaning going 2 modal whole steps up from the tonic point of inversion, which happens to land on nodal point 2, which is the Dorian node. Then next, we have the third inversion, G13/F, would better be called a 7x/3 or an x6/3, which would be a 7-note Mixolydian third inversion, or Mixolydian 6 modal whole step third inversion, meaning go 3 modal whole steps up from the root of the Mixolydian node, which would get you to nodal point number 4, make that the lowest nodal point. Nodal point number 4 is the Lydian. Then we've got a fifth inversion, G13/A, would better be 7x/4 or x6/4, which would be a 7-note Mixolydian fourth inversion, or Mixolydian 6 modal whole step fourth inversion, meaning go 4 modal whole steps up from the tonic of Mixolydian, which would get you to the Aeolian, making it the lowest note of it for the fourth inversion there. So the next, we have the fifth inversion, which would be a G13/C, which would better be a 7x/5 or an x6/5, which means 7-note Mixolydian fifth inversion, Mixolydian 6 modal whole step fifth inversion, go 5 modal whole steps up from the tonic, which is going from Mixolydian to landing on the Ionian, and the Ionian would be the lowest note then. Lastly, we have a sixth inversion, which would be a G13/E, which would better be a 7x/6 or x6/6 for 7-note Mixolydian 6th inversion or Mixolydian 6 modal whole step 6th inversion, meaning go 6 modal whole steps up from the tonic, which is nodal point number 5, or Mixolydian, which will land you on nodal point number 3, which is the Phrygian. So here's going to be the letters of the nodal points. So that's going to be the idea. If you were, now again, you got to bridge these two things out, but if you start playing the guitar and you see the guitar positions by absolute nodal points, you're numbering the guitar, it's way cleaner. And then when you look at your chords, if you can see your chords by distance, this notation, then you'll start to actually memorize the chords by the nodal points of the chords, looking at modal whole steps, and then everything is transferable and copy and pasteable. It's way more efficient to learn to navigate like a fretboard or any instrument really in that format. The piano's a little bit more difficult because again, it's not totally symmetrical, but still, even then, the whole concept would be conceptually copied and pasted in your mind, at least from a pure, music system in terms of the spacing of it. It would be a lot more efficient. On a guitar, there's no question that this would be more efficient way if you could just visualize on the guitar the numbers of the nodal points that are in the collection of notes that you're working on, and then build the chords based on distance terminology, being able to then work on your conversions between distances, that being the conversion of half steps to modal half steps to modal whole steps, and then be able to convert that to scale degrees. The better you can do that, the more like conceptual framework you'll have of the system.